Welcome back into the Daily Dose. I'm your host, Jeff Hansen. As always, the show is brought to you by Give'emHellBrigham.com and by CougarSportsInsider.com, part of the 24/7 Sports Network. Thank you to those of you who have already subscribed to the channel. If you haven't done so yet, hit that subscribe button, like this video, leave us a comment, all of those things that help us grow and help us impress the YouTube algorithm. That's what we're all about. We're just here looking for validation from the algorithm, and your support helps us get that validation that I so desperately need. I just need to be validated. So thank you. Thank you so much for stroking my ego and helping me feel validated by the YouTube algorithm with your support. Thank you in advance for your support of the Daily Dose. Today, I've got two lists of BYU players. I've got the list of the 10 best BYU players and the 10 most irreplaceable BYU football players for the 2023 season, of course. And who came up with these lists? I did, right? I mean, they're not gospel truth. Some people may have differences of opinion, but that's really not what we're here to argue about today. What we're here to look at is I think that we have a tendency as fans to say that the 10 best players or the best players on the roster are always the most irreplaceable players on the roster. And I just don't think that's the case. And so what I've done is I put together a top 10 of each list, each category, and we're just going to look at those lists and kind of see who needs to be a star for BYU in order for BYU to achieve their goals, and who has to stay on the field for BYU no matter what in order for BYU to achieve their goals. So let's start with the 10 best players. I think number one is obvious, Kingsley Suamataia. He's a first-round talent. I mean, he's exceptional. He's going to be a left tackle. He's going to push for All-American status. Kingsley is fantastic. Number two, Aiden Robbins. I think the UNLV transfer is the second most talented football player on BYU's roster. Cougars would have loved to have him out of high school. They've got him now, and though he has 2 years of eligibility remaining, he's probably only sticking around for one. If he has a productive year, he'll take his chances at the NFL next season. So BYU's got to enjoy him while they've got him, and I think he could get to another 1,000-yard rushing season this year. Number three, I've got AJ Vongphachanh as the most talented player on the roster. The dude is for real, and we don't talk about him much, presumably because he came from Utah State. If he was a recruit who had turned down Minnesota and South Carolina and all the P5 schools that AJ turned down out of the transfer portal, we'd be over the moon excited about him. I think that Vongphachanh is going to have a huge role for BYU this year. Number four, Jacob Robinson. The dude's legit. There's no question about it that J-Rob is the best member of the BYU secondary. He can do everything. He can play safety. He can play nickel. He plays outside. He helps in the run game. He does everything for BYU. Number five, I've got Eddie Heckard, his running mate, Jacob Robinson's running mate in the secondary. Eddie Heckard comes to BYU from Weber State. Exceptionally talented, exceptionally productive during his time at Utah State, his time at Weber State. Those are kind of the same programs, though, aren't they? So his time at Weber State, exceptionally productive. If Eddie Heckard can replicate that production, he's going to go down as a legend at BYU. He's a phenomenal football player. Number six, I've got Connor Pay. And a lot of that is because of what he brings to the table as a center, but also his ability to be multiple and play a variety of positions along the offensive line. That makes him invaluable to BYU, and he's really, really, really good at all of those interior offensive line positions. Connor Pay is a great talent. Number seven on our best players list, Micah Harper. When he moved to the safety spot, questions about the safety position were answered. Micah Harper is that guy, and he's going to continue to be that guy for BYU this year. Number eight, Cody Epps. So big that BYU got him back from the transfer portal. I don't think he's a Puka Nacua guy who would have been absolutely irreplaceable, but in terms of what he does bring to the table, you absolutely want to have Cody Epps on your roster, and now BYU does. He is the most likely candidate, in my opinion, to emerge as the true wide receiver one for Keaton Slovis and the offense this year. Number nine, Tyler Batty. I think Batty's going to have a big year. He finally has coaches that coach that position. He finally has a defensive scheme that emphasizes the defensive end position. And he's always had the physical skills and the motor and all that stuff to be really, really good. I think for the first time in his BYU career, Tyler Batty's going to have the talent and the coaching and scheme that matches that talent, and he's poised for a big season. Finally, number 10 on my list of the most talented players on BYU's roster, Keaton Slovis. The raw talent is there. Look, his year at Pitt was dreadful. We can't ignore that. And I think BYU fans are excited for what Keaton Slovis brings to the table, and we should be. but we can't ignore that year at Pitt. It was bad. But from a talent standpoint, the guy still has that kind of talent, and I trust that Aaron Roderick will be able to get that talent out of him. So, reviewing the list, the 10 best players on BYU's roster: Kingsley Suamataia, Aiden Robbins, AJ Vongphachon, Jacob Robinson, Eddie Heckard, Connor Pay, Micah Harper, Cody Epps, Tyler Batty, and finally, Keaton Slovis. Now let's look at the 10 most irreplaceable players, because the names are different, and I think that they're different for a pretty good reason. Number one, still Kingsley. Kingsley has to be an anchor for BYU at left tackle. I like the depth of the offensive line, and I like the depth at tackle, but Kingsley is so much better than everybody else in that room, including guys like Caleb Etienne, who are very, very, very good. The drop-off is immense. You cannot lose Kingsley. Number two, Keaton Slovis. I don't think he's the second most talented player on the roster, but I don't think we want to get to a scenario where BYU is going into the Big 12, their first year into the Big 12, and they are turning to a JUCO transfer who's never played D1 ball in Jake Retzloff, or a true freshman in Ryder Burton, or maybe Cade Finnegan, who hasn't really been able to cement himself as a QB2, despite it being his third or fourth year in the program. Keaton Slovis is irreplaceable. He's got to stay healthy, and he's got to produce in order for BYU to get to a bowl game in 2023. Number three, Jackson Cravens. The interior of BYU's defensive line is suspect. There's a lot of question marks still. And surprisingly, BYU didn't bring in as many guys out of the transfer portal as everybody thought that they would. Cravens is one that they did bring in, and they brought him in really early. As soon as he hit the portal, it was a match made in heaven. Cravens he's got to stay healthy. He's got to stay on the field, and he's got to be the anchor in the middle of that BYU defensive line. I don't think he's the most talented defensive tackle in the country. I don't think he's got a ton of NFL potential, but he's got the potential to be a very, very good college football player, and that's exactly what BYU needs him to be. After Cravens, I think there's a lot more question marks on the interior of the defensive line. BYU cannot lose Cravens for any extended amount of time in 2023. Number four, Eddie Heckard, and number five, Camden Garrett. Both cornerbacks coming from Weber State. We've talked about Heckard. Garrett's a lot like Heckard, just without the flash. Garrett is also a very productive player. He's also played a number of years within the Jay Hill defensive scheme, and he's also probably going to be penciled in as a starter going into fall camp at BYU. Those two players are great, and with Jacob Robinson, I feel really good about the BYU cornerback position. Behind those three, and particularly behind Garrett and Heckard, I get a little bit more concerned. Jacob Robinson could play a variety of different positions, and so there's guys who are equipped to replace Robinson should he go down, because he just does a little bit of everything. But Garrett and Heckard are true, bona fide man coverage cornerbacks, and BYU just doesn't have very many of those. They cannot afford to lose those two. Caleb Etienne is the next player on the irreplaceable list for a lot of the same reasons that Kingsley is number one. Etienne, there's a big drop-off between Kingsley and Etienne, but I think there's a similar drop-off from Etienne and the next offensive tackle. That's not to say that I don't like guys like Braden Keim or Ian Fitzgerald, Jake Griffin. I do. I like those guys a lot. I just don't like them as much as I like Caleb Etienne in 2023. I would be pretty concerned if Etienne or Kingsley go down for any extended amount of time. Jacob Robinson's next on my list for all the reasons we've talked about. His ability to do so many things is going to give Jay Hill so many options in how to use him. I think we're all going to be very surprised with what Jacob Robinson does on the field this year and how he's used. Tyler Batty is number 8 on this list for the reasons we talked about. I think his talent matches his irreplaceability. Is that a word? Tyler Batty's that important for BYU. The Cougars desperately have to have a pass rush, and Tyler Batty's the most well-equipped to do that. And finally, the last two on our irreplaceable list, Cody Epps and Chase Roberts. I like BYU's top 5 wide receivers. I like Roberts and Epps emerging as the top 2 wide receivers. I get a little bit more worried after wide receiver 5. I think Parker Kingston is good. I think that there's talent there. I think Koa Eldridge is going to be a very good player. But I don't want to learn how good they're going to be in 2023. I want to see them in 2024. I want them to get some more practice reps under their belt, and then we start talking about how good of a player they can develop into. But for 2023, I want some combination of those top 5 wide receivers to be on the field at all times. And no matter what that combination is, I want Cody Epps and Chase Roberts to be one of the players on the field. I don't see very many scenarios where BYU has a productive passing game if Roberts and Epps are both off the field. So those two they round out my list of irreplaceable players on BYU's roster. So the lists are similar, right? You've got Kingsley, you've got Heckard, you've got J-Rob. They're both on the most talented list and the most irreplaceable list, but they're in different orders, and there are other names there. Jackson Cravens, Camden Garrett, Caleb Etienne. There's some players who maybe aren't the most talented for BYU, but they are absolutely irreplaceable, and the Cougars cannot afford to lose them in 2023. Overall, I think we could extend this list to 25 guys. I love the talent that BYU has brought into the roster, and I think that the Cougars have more depth than they have in the last couple of years. And we've talked about that a lot. BYU has improved their depth over the last few years of independence, and it's been a huge emphasis for Kalani Sitake and his staff. It's better, but in 2023, it's noticeably different, particularly on the defensive side of the ball. It's better in big chunks. Think about it like you go for being an hourly employee who's just starting your career, where you're negotiating raises in $1 or $2 an hour chunks, compared to somebody who's a little bit more established that you start negotiating in $25,000 chunks for your raises. I mean, that's kind of where we're at. I mean, BYU's now elevated themselves from a roster standpoint that we're talking about big material chunks of improvement and progress on in terms of depth. And I think that's very important for BYU going into the Big 12. Still got to get better, but I like where BYU's at. Ultimately, I'm excited for the season and excited to see this talent on the field. Thank you so much for your support, for taking some time out of your day to spend with us here at the Daily Dose. And until next time, give them hell.